The millionaire CEO lived for silence and control, until he saw a little girl in a white dress crying alone, and everything he thought he knew shattered in seconds. Adrian Harper had built his life around silence. In his world, everything was orderly, predictable, and quiet. His penthouse on the 42nd floor overlooked the city but never let its noise in, thanks to custom soundproofing. His office was a sanctuary of hushed tones, subtle footsteps, and distant city hum, always muted behind thick glass walls. Even his car drove in silence, gliding through traffic like a shadow. Adrian didn't just prefer silence, he needed it. He believed noise was weakness, that chaos broke focus, and that peace only came when distractions were shut out completely. Children, with their cries, their sticky hands, and their unpredictability, didn't belong in his life. He didn't dislike them out of cruelty, he simply saw them as a different species altogether, wild, emotional, and loud. He had built his empire in that silence, brick by brick, over years of calculated precision and disciplined solitude. That morning, like most others, had been structured perfectly. He woke at 6, worked out in his private gym, reviewed investor reports while sipping a measured cup of espresso, and left his penthouse exactly at 8:15. The only deviation from his usual path was a meeting scheduled by his assistant with a potential partner who insisted on a neutral location, a private corner in a public park near the investor's home. Adrian hated the idea but agreed, knowing the investment was worth the inconvenience. He arrived 10 minutes early, naturally. The park was surprisingly quiet for a weekday morning, the trees just beginning to bloom, birds chirping faintly overhead. He stood near the designated bench, checking his watch, then his phone, already calculating how long he'd tolerate a delay. Then, a sound pierced his carefully constructed peace. At first, it was faint, distant enough to ignore, a soft whimpering sound carried on the breeze. He glanced over his shoulder, annoyed, expecting a dog. But it grew louder. It became a series of choked sobs, high-pitched and unsteady. Adrian exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to walk away. He had no time or patience for interruptions. But the crying didn't stop. In fact, it was getting closer. Reluctantly, almost against his nature, he turned to locate the source. What he saw stopped him cold. A little girl, no more than 3 years old, was sitting on a bench a few yards away, her knees pulled up to her chest, her white dress wrinkled and slightly stained, her matching white sun hat askew. Her small hands rubbed at her eyes, and her face was flushed with tears. Her soft blonde hair peeked out from under the hat in uneven strands. She looked up, as if sensing him, and their eyes met. Brown eyes, deep, wide, and eerily familiar. Adrian stared, frozen, caught off guard not just by the scene, but by the inexplicable pull he felt. She looked like someone. Someone he hadn't seen in years. Someone whose absence had once left a space in his otherwise structured life that he had sealed off and never revisited. He told himself to walk away. The girl would be someone else's problem. A lost child, maybe, or one whose parent was nearby. But she didn't move. No adult came. And then, in a trembling voice that shook something deep inside him, she said, Are you Mr. Harper?" His breath caught. He hadn't told anyone his name in the park. No one knew who he was, he'd made sure of it. Yet here she was, sitting alone, asking for him by name. Adrian stepped closer slowly, pulse beginning to quicken. "Yes," he said cautiously. "Who are you?" The little girl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Maggie said you might come." That name hit him like a bolt. Maggie. It couldn't be. Maggie had been the best friend, the confidant, the one who stood silently beside Hazel during the months Adrian had tried to forget. The girl looked up again and whispered, "My name's Lily. I'm 3. Then, more softly, "I think you're my dad." In that moment, the world tilted. The silence he had protected for years shattered like glass, not from chaos or disaster, but from the soft, shaking voice of a little girl in white who carried his eyes. Adrian stood motionless, every logical part of his mind scrambling for an explanation while his heart beat unsteadily in his chest. The child in front of him, Lily, was looking up at him with eyes that mirrored his own, and despite the shock running through him, he couldn't deny the striking resemblance. Her voice, soft and hesitant, echoed in his ears, repeating again and again, "I think you're my dad." For a man who had always dismissed emotion as noise and unpredictability as weakness, Adrian found himself suddenly drowning in both. The wind stirred gently through the trees above, and still no one came forward. No frantic parent appeared. It was just her. Just Lily. And she had come expecting him. Before he could respond, a woman hurried across the grass, breathless and clearly distressed. Her coat was misbuttoned, her hair escaping the clip that barely held it in place. The moment she saw Adrian standing next to Lily, she slowed, eyes widening with recognition and anxiety. "Mr. Harper?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Adrian turned toward her, tense, guarded, 100 questions piling up behind his calm exterior. "Yes," he said evenly. "And you are?" She hesitated, glancing between him and the little girl before finally stepping closer. "I'm Maggie. I was Hazel's friend. And Lily's nanny since she was born." At the mention of Hazel's name, 1,000 memories surged forward in Adrian's mind like a sudden flood. Hazel. The woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation. The only person who had ever gotten close enough to unsettle his world. He hadn't seen her in 3 years, hadn't heard her voice, hadn't received so much as a message. And now, here was Maggie, someone tied to that chapter of his life, standing in front of him with the very proof of Hazel's absence wrapped in white lace and tiny trembling fingers. "Where is she?" Adrian asked, though he already knew the answer. Maggie's eyes welled up, and she nodded, swallowing hard. "Hazel passed away. A car accident. Just a few weeks ago. I've been caring for Lily since then, but," she broke off, looking at Lily with pain in her expression. "Before she died, Hazel told me everything. About you. About what happened. And she asked me, if anything ever happened to her, to find you. To bring Lily to you." Adrian's knees felt unstable, but he stood still, forcing composure. It was too much too quickly, Hazel's death, the existence of a daughter he had never known, the sudden responsibility thrust into his arms without warning. He looked down at Lily, who stood silently at his side, her small fingers now gripping the hem of his coat. She hadn't cried again. She was just watching, waiting, as if she instinctively understood that her future depended on this moment. "Why didn't she tell me?" Adrian's voice was quieter now, not cold but weary, aching. "Why didn't she ever say a word?" Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. "She wanted to. I think she wrote letters, maybe even tried to call. But Hazel was scared. She thought you'd push her away. She said she didn't want to trap you or ruin your life. So she did what she thought was best. She raised Lily alone. But when she knew her time might be short, she changed her mind. She knew you had a right to know. She told me everything. Hazel trusted you more than you know, even if she never told you directly." Adrian didn't respond right away. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest like stone. His whole life, structured, flawless, built on certainty, had just shifted beneath him. Yet in the middle of that tremor stood a 3-year-old girl with his eyes, watching him not with fear, but with a quiet hopefulness that terrified him more than anything else ever had. He crouched down, meeting her gaze. "Lily," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "do you want to come with me for a while? Maybe just to get something to eat. Somewhere warm." She nodded without hesitation. "Okay." And just like that, she placed her small hand in his, as if it belonged there all along. As they walked away from the park together, Maggie trailing behind them, Adrian felt a crack forming in the wall he'd built around his life. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, a subtle breaking open. He didn't know what this meant yet. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't even know if he believed he could be. But she was here. Hazel was gone. And this little girl had come into his silence and spoken his name like she'd known him all her life. And somehow, in the middle of all the confusion, Adrian Harper didn't feel lost. He just felt needed. Adrian had never felt so unprepared in his entire life. In a single afternoon, the routine he had clung to for years had disintegrated. Sitting across from a 3-year-old girl in a quiet corner of a small cafe, he stared down at the untouched cup of black coffee in front of him while Lily quietly sipped apple juice through a red straw. Maggie sat nearby, watchful but silent, giving them space but not quite letting go. The child, his child, was oddly calm, her small legs swinging under the table, her eyes roaming the cafe with a kind of quiet curiosity. Adrian wasn't sure what surprised him more, the fact that Hazel had kept such a monumental secret from him, or the fact that the little girl sitting across from him already felt familiar. He found himself studying her, not just the eyes that mirrored his own or the soft wave of her light hair, but the subtle expressions on her face, the way her lips pressed together when she was thinking, how her brow furrowed when the waitress took too long. It was eerie, like watching a reflection of emotions he'd long learned to suppress. And yet she wasn't cold or guarded, she was warm, cautious but brave, like she had seen more in her 3 short years than most adults could handle. He asked her what she liked to eat. She answered in a tiny voice, macaroni. And pancakes. But not at the same time. That made Maggie chuckle softly, and Adrian nodded, signaling to the waitress. As the food came and Lily carefully picked at her plate, he sat in silence, trying to find words. He wasn't good at this. He wasn't sure if you were supposed to talk to a child like they were fragile or like they were adults. But Lily didn't seem to need much prompting. She told him she liked clouds, music, and that Maggie sang lullabies every night even though she wasn't her real mom. She told him she used to live in a place with a piano and plants and a big window where the sun came in. And when she mentioned Hazel, just once, calling her mommy in the past tense, his breath caught. Later, when they walked out of the cafe into the cooler air, Adrian paused on the sidewalk. He looked at Maggie. I need to understand everything, he said firmly. Everything Hazel told you. I need the truth, not just fragments. Maggie nodded. I'll tell you everything I know. But not here. She handed him an envelope. This was the last letter Hazel wrote. She asked me to give it to you only if you met Lily. Back at his apartment, Adrian sat alone in his office with the letter in his hands. His penthouse, usually quiet in a way he had always appreciated, now felt oppressively silent. He could hear Maggie reading to Lily in the guest room he'd hastily prepared. The gentle murmur of voices in the distance was like an echo from a different life. He opened the letter slowly, hands trembling. Hazel's handwriting was soft, familiar. She apologized first. For disappearing, for hiding the truth, for doubting him. She told him she hadn't left because she didn't love him, she had left because she did. She was afraid he'd feel trapped, that the man who lived in a world of silence and order would see a child as a threat to that life. She wrote that she had tried to contact him once but lost her nerve. That every day, she looked into Lily's face and saw pieces of him and wondered if she'd made the right choice. And when she got sick, really sick, she realized how wrong she'd been to keep them apart. I didn't want Lily to grow up without knowing you, Hazel wrote. I didn't want her to feel unwanted, or like she was a secret. I just wanted her to be safe. And now I have to trust that you'll keep her safe. I know you don't believe in fate, Adrian, but if you're reading this, then maybe something bigger than both of us made this moment happen. Please, love her. Not because she's yours. But because she's worth it. When he finished the letter, Adrian sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. He hadn't cried in years. Not when his father died. Not during heartbreaks. Not when Hazel left. But now he did. Silent, restrained tears that slipped down his face as the weight of everything pressed in on him. He had lost Hazel again, this time forever. But he had been given something just as real, just as irreversible. A child. His child. He rose slowly, walked down the hall, and stopped at the doorway. Maggie looked up from the book she was reading. Lily was already half asleep, curled beneath the blanket, her small frame tucked against Maggie's side. Adrian entered quietly and knelt beside the bed. For a moment, he just watched her breathe, her face peaceful, her hand resting against her cheek. He whispered, barely audible, "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in his life, he truly meant it. The following morning, Adrian awoke earlier than usual, long before the sun had broken through the thick city skyline. His room was still dark, but he didn't reach for his phone or his schedule like he always did. Instead, he lay there staring at the ceiling, listening, not for silence, but for something else. And then he heard it. The faint shuffle of small feet, a quiet voice humming a tune that was unfamiliar to him, and the gentle creak of the guest room door down the hall. It wasn't noise. It was life. It was real. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel the instinct to shut it out. He rose slowly, got dressed without rushing, and stepped into a day that no longer belonged to just him. In the kitchen, Maggie was already preparing breakfast. The scent of scrambled eggs and toast filled the air, and Lily sat at the counter in a chair far too big for her, kicking her feet against the wooden stool, wearing pajamas patterned with tiny suns and clouds. When she saw him, she smiled softly but didn't say anything, just watched him with curiosity, like she was still trying to figure out what he meant in her world. He greeted her gently, unsure if he was supposed to act casual or like the moment mattered more than anything. So instead of overthinking it, he asked if she wanted orange juice, and she nodded as if they'd done this 100 times before. As Maggie set down plates in front of them, Adrian tried to ignore the strangeness of how familiar it already felt. He wasn't used to anyone else being in his space this early. His mornings were usually solitary, built around efficiency and silence. But now there was conversation, small and simple, about whether strawberries were better than bananas and if socks could be worn to bed. There were crumbs on the table, a spoon clinking against a glass, and a faint giggle when he made a face at a too sour piece of fruit. And somehow, he didn't mind any of it. After breakfast, Maggie gently pulled him aside while Lily played with her stuffed bunny near the window. Her voice was low, cautious but sincere. She told him more about Hazel's final days, how quickly her health had declined, how she'd refused to let Lily see her in the worst moments, how she had planned everything in a rush once she realized she might not survive. Adrian listened in silence, every word landing heavy in his chest. She told him Hazel had never stopped loving him, that her leaving had nothing to do with rejection and everything to do with fear, fear of breaking what they had, fear that she would become an anchor in a life she thought he never wanted changed. Maggie admitted she hadn't agreed with Hazel's choice to keep the secret, but she had respected her wishes. She said Hazel's greatest regret wasn't the illness or the struggle, it was not giving Lily and Adrian time together from the beginning. It was the days they'd missed. Adrian felt that weight settle deep inside him. He didn't know how to process the fact that 3 years of his daughter's life had already passed without him. First steps. First words. First tears. He had missed all of them. And yet, Lily didn't seem to resent him. She wasn't afraid of him. She was cautious, yes, but she looked at him like she believed he belonged in her world now. Later that day, while Maggie handled some errands, Adrian took Lily to a small bookstore nearby. It was the first time he had been out in public with her alone. People glanced at him, surprised to see the reserved, famously stoic CEO holding the hand of a toddler in pigtails. She picked out a book with sparkles on the cover and clung to it like it was treasure. At the register, she asked him, quietly, "Can you read it to me tonight?" It was such a small question, but it caught him off guard. He realized he'd never read a bedtime story before. He'd never tucked a child in. But he nodded, smiled slightly, and said, "Of course." That night, as Lily lay under soft blankets in the room that was slowly becoming hers, Adrian sat beside her and opened the glittery book. His voice was stiff at first, unused to the rhythm, but Lily didn't seem to care. She watched him with wide eyes, smiling when he gave different voices to the characters, even laughing when he tried and failed to sound like a talking bear. When he finished, she didn't ask for another story. She simply whispered, "Mommy used to read to me like that. But you do it different. I like your way too." Adrian sat with her until she fell asleep, her tiny hand resting near his arm. When he finally rose and stepped out into the hallway, he leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. This wasn't about making up for lost time. It was about starting now, with what he had. And what he had was a little girl with a bunny in one hand and a book in the other, who had accepted him into her life without asking for perfection, just presence. Just love. And Adrian was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, that was something he could give. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Adrian hadn't expected, one that felt strangely natural despite how unfamiliar it should have been. He was waking up earlier than usual, not to check emails or prepare for conference calls, but to make sure Lily had her favorite cereal and that her shoes weren't on the wrong feet. The structure he had once worshipped was now softened by unpredictability, mornings filled with scattered toys, impromptu giggles, and questions that had nothing to do with business forecasts or market trends. And instead of fighting it, he found himself leaning into it, as if a different version of himself was emerging from under layers of control he no longer needed. He began to notice the smallest things, how Lily's nose scrunched when she concentrated, the way she hummed softly when coloring, how her entire body seemed to relax when he took her hand. She was cautious with him, still unsure where he fit in her world, but she was open, never cold, and each day brought a little more trust. Adrian was learning how to be present in ways he never imagined. He found himself pausing meetings to take calls from Maggie or to video chat with Lily before her nap, and not once did he feel guilt or shame about prioritizing her over a spreadsheet. For the first time, he realized he didn't need to apologize for being human. One afternoon, while Adrian was in his office reviewing contracts, Maggie walked in quietly and handed him a folder. She had a serious look on her face, and he immediately set everything down. She explained that it was Lily's birth certificate and medical documents, records Hazel had kept safe but never shared. As he flipped through the pages, his breath caught when he saw his name listed under "Father." Hazel hadn't just assumed responsibility alone, she had always known he was Lily's father, had claimed him on paper even when she couldn't reach him in person. It was her silent way of connecting them, even in absence. Inside the folder, Maggie had also placed a small envelope labeled in Hazel's handwriting. It simply read, "For Adrian, if he ever comes." Adrian stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letter was short, but it was everything he needed to hear. Hazel wrote about the night she'd found out she was pregnant, how she'd stood outside his building with shaking hands, then turned away, convinced he would choose silence over love. She admitted she had been wrong, not about who he was, but about not trusting him to choose differently. She wrote about Lily's first laugh, her first word, the way she clung to the idea of her dad, even though they had never met. "She always believed you were real," Hazel wrote. "She never needed convincing. And I think, deep down, I never did either." Adrian read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and locking it in the top drawer of his desk. His hands trembled slightly, not from anger or regret, but from something deeper, a kind of reckoning. Hazel had given him a second chance. It wasn't fair that she hadn't lived to see it through, but it wasn't too late for him to honor her trust. He could still give Lily everything she needed. That night, after Lily had gone to sleep, Adrian found himself wandering into her room. He stood at the edge of her bed, watching her small frame rise and fall with each breath. A soft nightlight painted the walls in warm, shifting colors, and the bunny she always slept with was tucked under her arm. He pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders, then sat in the chair across the room, unsure if he wanted to leave. He sat there for a long time, thinking about Hazel, about how his silence had once cost him so much. He had always believed control was his only strength, but it had kept him from the most important moments of his life. He didn't want that anymore. He didn't want to miss anything else. The next morning, he called his legal team. He asked them to start the paperwork for legal guardianship and adoption. He wanted his name on every document not just because it was true, but because he needed Lily to know she was wanted, chosen, not just a responsibility inherited by accident. When he told Lily that he wanted to become her real dad on paper, she tilted her head in that thoughtful way she had and asked, "But aren't you already?" He smiled at her, heart tightening, and said, "Yes. But now I want to make sure the whole world knows it too." She didn't say anything else, just reached out and wrapped her arms around his neck. Adrian held her close, feeling the weight of her small arms and the promise they represented. He knew there was still so much to learn, and that he would make mistakes, but in that moment, he stopped being afraid of it. Because she had already accepted him, flawed, uncertain, and trying. And that was more than enough to begin. Spring came softly, brushing the city with warmth and light that made everything feel new. For Adrian, the world outside had always felt distant, too fast, too loud, too uncertain, but now he noticed the way the air smelled after rain, how the trees outside Lily's window bloomed in quiet colors, and how every part of his life had slowly shifted into something he never expected. Mornings were no longer about rushing through meetings but about packing lunch boxes and brushing tangles out of Lily's hair while she chatted about her dreams. Evenings were no longer quiet but filled with questions, little giggles, messy dinners, and sometimes tears. But it didn't overwhelm him. It grounded him. It gave his life edges that felt real, even when imperfect. Lily was growing quickly, adapting in ways that amazed him. She had adjusted to her new home with a kind of graceful resilience only children seemed to possess. She filled every room with her presence, not in a disruptive way, but in a way that made everything feel warmer. Adrian had watched as she turned his cold, minimalist space into something lived in. Her art hung crookedly on the refrigerator, her stuffed animals gathered in corners of the living room, her shoes somehow always ending up under his desk. He never moved them. He liked the way they reminded him she was there, that his home was no longer just his. But no matter how well things were going on the surface, he could sense something lingering beneath Lily's calm exterior. She had adjusted, yes, but there were nights when she'd quietly retreat, sitting on the windowsill in silence, staring at the stars as if waiting for someone to speak. There were moments she'd call him Dad and moments she'd stop herself, unsure. He never pushed. He let her come to him in her own time, even though every hesitant look tugged at something deep in him. One night, after a long day, Lily asked if they could have a picnic on the floor instead of sitting at the dining table. Adrian agreed without hesitation, and they spread a blanket in the middle of the living room, eating peanut butter sandwiches and drinking apple juice from teacups. She was unusually quiet, picking at the crust of her bread. Finally, in a small voice, she asked, "If Mommy could see me now, do you think she'd be proud of me?" Adrian felt the air still between them. He reached over and gently moved her hair from her eyes. "I think," he said softly, "your mom would be so proud, Lily. Not just because you're brave or smart, but because you love so deeply. That's something she gave you, I think." Lily looked at him for a long moment before leaning into his side. She didn't say anything, and he didn't need her to. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and held her until her breathing slowed and her eyes grew heavy with sleep. He carried her to bed that night and stayed there until she was fully asleep, the soft rhythm of her breathing anchoring him in a way nothing else ever had. As the adoption process moved forward, Adrian found himself telling more people about Lily. His colleagues were stunned, not just by the fact that he had a daughter, but by how completely he had embraced the role. He took her to the office one afternoon, and instead of being uncomfortable in the unfamiliar space, Lily walked confidently beside him, holding his hand and waving at everyone she passed. She sat in his chair, twirling around in circles, then handed him a drawing she'd made just for his office. It was the two of them holding hands under a tree, with the words, "My Dad," written in wobbly crayon across the top. He didn't frame business awards anymore. He framed that drawing. What surprised him most wasn't how much Lily needed him, it was how much he needed her. She challenged the way he thought, broke open the guarded places inside him, made him laugh in ways he hadn't since he was a child. She made him vulnerable, and instead of fearing it, he welcomed it. One evening, after reading a story and tucking her in, Lily reached for his hand and said, "You don't have to be perfect, you know. I just like when you're here." That sentence stayed with him long after she fell asleep. For a man who had spent his life building walls, Lily was the one who taught him that love wasn't about flawless moments or grand gestures, it was about being present, being seen, and staying, even when it was hard. And Adrian had no plans to go anywhere. Adrian had never been to a courtroom for anything personal. His life, up until recently, had been filled with lawyers, contracts, boardrooms, and business disputes, all of it kept at arm's length, filtered through assistants or legal teams. But this time, he sat in a simple wooden chair, in a small family court, waiting for a judge to call his name. He wasn't a CEO here. He wasn't powerful, wealthy, or in control. He was just a man hoping to be called a father, officially, legally, without question. Lily sat beside him, her legs too short to touch the floor, her fingers curled around a small plush rabbit she had carried everywhere since the day Maggie gave it to her after Hazel's funeral. She wore a pale yellow dress that Maggie had picked out for the occasion and a quiet expression that Adrian knew meant she was thinking hard, even if she said nothing. Maggie was there too, sitting a few rows back, offering him silent support in the way she always had. She hadn't just been Hazel's friend. She had become a bridge between the past and the future, a steady presence who reminded Lily of where she came from, while helping her feel safe with where she was going. The court clerk called their names, and Adrian took Lily's hand, guiding her gently as they stood and moved toward the front. The judge was a kind-looking woman in her 50s who smiled at Lily first, then turned her gaze to Adrian with the kind of practiced, neutral warmth people in her position had mastered. She asked him a series of questions, his name, occupation, intention in adopting Lily, and he answered each one clearly, his voice steady, his resolve firm. When the judge asked Lily if she was okay with Adrian adopting her, she nodded and whispered, "I already call him Dad sometimes," and the judge smiled. A few legal steps later, it was done. Adrian Harper was, in the eyes of the law and the world, Lily's father. There was no ceremony, no music or applause, but Adrian felt something shift inside him. It was as if something that had always belonged was finally in its right place. Lily didn't fully understand the significance, but she understood enough to squeeze his hand tighter and whisper, "We're a real family now, right?" And Adrian, with a voice that cracked slightly from the weight of it all, said, "We always were." They went out for ice cream afterward, just the two of them, and sat on a bench outside the parlor watching people pass by. Lily swung her legs back and forth and asked if now that they were official, they could maybe go visit a beach sometime. She had never seen the ocean, only in books and pictures, and she wanted to build a sandcastle and find seashells. Adrian said yes without hesitation and then realized he wanted to see the ocean through her eyes more than he had ever wanted any vacation or luxury in his life. Back at home that night, they opened a small envelope that Maggie had given them earlier that morning. It was from Hazel. It had been sealed and dated 3 weeks before she passed. Inside was a photograph, an old printed picture of Hazel holding a newborn Lily in a hospital bed, both of them tired but smiling. On the back, Hazel had written a note in her familiar handwriting, "Adrian, I always knew she'd end up with you. I just wish I could have seen it." Adrian didn't speak for a long time after reading it. He just held the photograph in one hand and Lily's small hand in the other. Later that night, after she was asleep, he framed the photo and placed it on his desk next to the drawing Lily had made. It wasn't about replacing Hazel or erasing the pain of her absence, it was about carrying her memory into the new life they had built. He would never forget her, and he wouldn't let Lily forget her either. She would grow up knowing that she had been deeply loved, not just by the mother who gave her life but by the father who almost didn't know he could love at all. The next morning, Lily came into his room just after sunrise, crawling up beside him under the blankets. She didn't say anything, just tucked her head under his chin and whispered, "Good morning, Daddy." It was the first time she'd said it without hesitation. He closed his eyes and held her close, knowing without doubt that nothing in his life, not the company he built, not the wealth he acquired, not the control he used to cling to, would ever mean more than this moment. He was no longer living in a quiet world made only for himself. He was living for her. Summer arrived quietly, bringing with it golden mornings and warm evenings that stretched longer than they had any right to. Adrian found himself waking up to the sound of Lily's voice more often than an alarm clock. She would tiptoe into his room with her bunny in one hand and a new idea in the other. Sometimes it was breakfast in bed made of imaginary toast, other times it was a question about clouds or dinosaurs or why birds never seemed to get lost. He'd never imagined a life like this, but now that he had it, he couldn't imagine going back to the silence that used to define him. His world was fuller now, full of music, laughter, the occasional tantrum, and the unrelenting, beautiful chaos of being a parent. They did go to the ocean. Lily wore a sun hat too big for her head and carried a plastic pail in each hand as if her job was the most important in the world. Adrian watched her from his chair, his sleeves rolled up and sand between his fingers, and realized how much he had changed. He still checked emails, still made decisions for a company worth billions, but his time no longer belonged to business alone. It belonged to moments like these, to watching Lily chase waves and collect broken shells like treasure. She brought him one shaped like a heart and said, "This is for Mommy. I think she would like this one," and he nodded, unable to speak as he tucked it safely into his pocket. Back home, they decorated a corner of the house just for Hazel. It was Lily's idea. A small shelf with framed photos, a few of her mother's music books, and the heart-shaped shell they'd brought back from the beach. Every night before bed, Lily would say goodnight to it, whispering little thoughts or wishes. Adrian never asked what she said. It was her space, her connection, and he respected it. One evening, she turned to him and said, "I think Mommy would like you now," and he smiled, brushing her hair back from her face. "I hope so," he answered softly, knowing that all he could do was keep proving it. The adoption papers had long been signed, but the reality of their bond had taken root deeper than any legal document could reach. They celebrated their first family anniversary, in a quiet way, just the two of them baking a cake together, making a mess of the kitchen, and dancing barefoot to songs she picked. He let her choose the music even though it made no sense to him. She laughed until she couldn't breathe when he tried to twirl her and knocked over a mixing bowl. In that laughter, in that shared moment, he saw the future, imperfect, unscripted, and completely theirs. Adrian also started making changes at work. He set up a foundation in Hazel's name, one focused on supporting single parents and children dealing with grief. He didn't announce it with a press release or interviews. He just quietly directed funds, built a team, and let the work speak for itself. It felt like something that mattered in a way numbers and deals never had. He told Lily about it one night while tucking her in, and she asked if they could help other kids find their missing dads. He kissed her forehead and said, "That's the plan." As the season deepened, Lily began calling him Dad all the time. It was no longer uncertain or hesitant. It was natural. It was real. And every time she said it, Adrian felt it land in his chest like a promise. He still had hard days, still questioned himself, still feared failing her. But each bedtime hug, every morning laugh, every drawing taped crookedly on his office wall reminded him that love wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, about showing up even when you weren't sure how, about holding steady through the messy and the beautiful alike. One night, after reading her a story and turning off the light, she whispered in the dark, "Thank you for finding me." He didn't respond right away. His throat was tight, and his heart was too full. But eventually, he said, "Thank you for letting me." And as she drifted to sleep, her hand resting in his, Adrian stayed there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her breath, knowing that this quiet, ordinary moment was the most extraordinary thing he had ever been a part of. He had spent his life chasing control, silence, and success. Now, he found peace in unpredictability, in noise, in love. And the man who once avoided every emotional risk had discovered that the greatest gift wasn't in what he had built, it was in who he had become. Not the CEO, not the millionaire, not the man who ran from connection. He was Lily's father. And in the life they now shared, that meant everything. In my opinion, the ending of this story is exactly what it needed to be: quiet, deeply emotional, and full of earned hope. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or over-the-top gestures, but instead finds its power in small, intimate moments that carry immense weight. Adrian's transformation isn't sudden or perfect, it unfolds gradually, through discomfort, grief, and love he never thought himself capable of. What makes the conclusion so beautiful is that it doesn't try to erase the pain of the past, it embraces it, learns from it, and builds something stronger in its place. Lily's presence brings out a version of Adrian that he didn't know existed, and watching him grow into that role, not because he had to but because he chose to, is incredibly moving. The story proves that family isn't just biology or legality, it's commitment, connection, and the courage to show up every single day. And in the end, Adrian isn't a hero because he's wealthy or successful, he's a hero because he becomes present, vulnerable, and willing to love fully. That, to me, is the most powerful kind of ending. Edward Stanton built his life on control, precision, and power. He never let anything disrupt his plans, until a small hand gripped his wrist in the middle of a crowded airport. He looked down and met a pair of wide blue eyes, not just filled with confusion, but fear. "Please," the girl whispered. "Don't let go." For the first time in his life, Edward had no idea what to do next. Edward Stanton had never been a man who believed in fate. His life was built on discipline, precision, and careful planning, where every decision was calculated to bring him success. The airport was just another stop in his well-structured life, a transition point between one destination and another, a place where people came and went without a second thought. He walked through the terminal with his usual air of confidence, his mind already focused on the week ahead. A private jet awaited him on the tarmac, ready to take him to Europe for a long-overdue vacation. It wasn't that he needed the time off, Edward never needed a break, but his assistants had insisted, reminding him that even the most powerful executives required rest. He had agreed, if only to silence their concerns. As he approached the security checkpoint, his phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced down at the screen, scanning through the latest market reports. Everything was as expected, numbers rising exactly as he had predicted. A deal he had been working on for months was set to finalize, and by the time he landed in Paris, another acquisition would be secured. Everything was under control. Until it wasn't. A small hand suddenly grabbed his wrist, firm but trembling. He tensed instinctively, his body going rigid at the unexpected contact. Edward was not a man accustomed to being touched without permission. His head snapped up, prepared to pull away, to demand an explanation, but the words never left his lips. A little girl stood before him. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her straight blonde hair fell just past her shoulders, slightly disheveled as if she had been running. Her bright blue eyes, eyes that mirrored his own, were wide with fear, her lips slightly parted as though she had meant to say something but had lost the courage at the last second. Edward frowned, glancing around. The airport was crowded, filled with families, business travelers, and tourists, yet no one seemed to notice her. There were no frantic parents searching nearby, no security officers rushing over to assist. She was alone. He looked back down at her, forcing himself to soften his voice. "Are you lost?" The girl tightened her grip on his wrist, her small fingers pressing against his skin. "Please," she whispered. "Help me." Edward's breath hitched, something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. He had handled hostile negotiations, multi-million-dollar mergers, and the collapse of entire companies without blinking an eye. Yet, standing here, looking into the desperate gaze of a child, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Where are your parents?" The girl shook her head, her blonde hair falling into her face. "I don't know." Edward studied her carefully. There was no hysterical crying, no panicked wailing for her mother or father. Just fear. Quiet, controlled fear, as if she understood far more than a child her age should. "What's your name?" he asked. For the first time, she hesitated. Her brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressing together, as if she were trying to remember. Then, almost too quietly, she whispered, "I don't know." Edward's pulse quickened. "You don't know your own name?" She shook her head again, her small fingers still clinging to his wrist. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a lost child wandering away from her parents. This was something else. Edward had planned every detail of his day, from the moment he left his penthouse to the second he would board his plane. But nowhere in those carefully laid out plans had he accounted for this. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his cuff with his free hand. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out." The girl's grip tightened for just a second before loosening slightly, as if his words had given her the smallest amount of reassurance. Edward Stanton had never believed in fate. But standing there, with a lost child holding onto him like he was her last hope, he had a feeling his life was about to change in ways he could have never anticipated. Edward Stanton had never been the kind of man to hesitate. His life was structured around quick, decisive action. Every deal he closed, every negotiation he entered, every calculated risk he took had been built on the certainty that hesitation led to failure. Yet, standing in the middle of a crowded airport with a little girl gripping his wrist like a lifeline, he found himself frozen, unsure of his next move for the first time in years. The girl was small, fragile-looking but composed in a way that didn't seem natural for a child her age. She wasn't crying, wasn't calling out for her parents, wasn't even looking around in search of someone familiar. Instead, she stood still, holding on to him with quiet determination, as if she had already decided that he was her only chance. Edward forced himself to think logically. The first step was security. They would have a protocol for lost children, a system in place to locate her parents or guardians. It was the simplest, most rational solution. Yet, when he started to move in the direction of the nearest security checkpoint, the girl pulled back. Her grip on his wrist tightened, her small fingers pressing into his skin with surprising strength. "No," she whispered. Edward stopped, glancing down at her. "They can help find your family," he said, keeping his voice calm. She shook her head, her blonde hair shifting slightly with the movement. "No. Please. Not them." Something in her voice, something raw and urgent, made him pause. He studied her, searching her face for answers she wasn't giving him. "Why not?" She looked around then, scanning the crowd with wide, wary eyes, her fingers still locked around his wrist. When she turned back to him, her voice was barely audible. "I don't think they're looking for me." Edward's stomach tightened. "Your parents?" he asked carefully. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head. "The people I was with." He narrowed his eyes. "Who were they?" She opened her mouth as if to answer, then quickly closed it, her entire body tensing. It was as if something had shifted in her mind, some warning that had been ingrained deep inside her, stopping her from saying too much. Edward exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket with his free hand, more out of habit than necessity. "All right," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it clear he wasn't going to push her, yet. "Then what do you want me to do?" The girl swallowed hard, her grip on him unwavering. "Don't let go." Edward wasn't sure why those words settled so heavily in his chest. He had spent his life keeping people at arm's length, maintaining a distance between himself and anything that resembled vulnerability. Even as a child, he had learned that attachment was a liability, that emotions were unpredictable and dangerous. He had built walls around himself that no one had ever broken through. And yet, here was this little girl, asking him for something so simple, something he had never given to anyone, his presence, his protection. He exhaled and nodded. Okay. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, enough for him to realize just how much she had been bracing herself for rejection. He glanced around the terminal, his mind working through his next steps. He couldn't just stand there with her indefinitely, but he also couldn't ignore the way she flinched at the thought of being taken by security. If she was afraid of the people who were supposed to be looking for her, that meant something was very wrong. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts before tapping on a number. The call rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Sir." "James," Edward said, his tone brisk. "I need you to meet me at the airport immediately. Something's come up." His assistant didn't question him. "Right away." Edward ended the call and looked down at the girl. "We're going to figure this out. But I need you to trust me." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I do." Edward wasn't sure why that one small sentence settled something inside him. But he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't letting her go. Edward stood with the little girl in the middle of the airport terminal, his mind racing through every possible scenario. The logical part of him knew the easiest course of action would be to hand her over to airport security, let them handle the situation, and board his flight as planned. That was what any reasonable person would do. That was what made sense. But something about her hesitation, about the way she had gripped his wrist and refused to let go, about the quiet fear in her bright blue eyes, told him that this wasn't a simple case of a lost child waiting to be reunited with her family. He had spent years making fast, efficient decisions that benefited his business. But this wasn't a business deal. This was a 6-year-old girl, standing beside him, clutching his sleeve like he was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't speak as they stood there, watching the flow of people around them. Her fingers had loosened slightly, but she hadn't let go of his hand. Edward glanced down at her. "Are you sure you don't remember anything?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together as if she was trying to force the words out. After a long moment, she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think I do. But it's not all there." Edward frowned. He had heard of trauma-induced memory loss before. He had read about it in passing, in reports about cases where people had blocked out certain events after experiencing something too overwhelming to process. But he had never seen it firsthand. He crouched down slightly, keeping his voice calm. "Think about the last thing you do remember. Where were you?" The girl's eyebrows furrowed, and she lowered her gaze to the floor. "I was in a car." Edward's jaw tightened. "With who?" She took a breath, her little hands balling into fists at her sides. "A man and a woman. But not my mom. Not my dad." His pulse quickened slightly. "Did they say anything to you?" She nodded, gripping the hem of her shirt. "They said to be quiet. That I had to wait. And that someone would come for me." Edward exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral, though every instinct in him told him this was worse than he had originally thought. A child who had been with people who weren't her parents, who had been told to wait for someone, who had been left in the middle of an airport with no memory of how she got there. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something else entirely. Before he could say anything, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the name on the screen. "James." He answered immediately. "Tell me you're here." "Just pulled up," his assistant replied. "Where are you?" "Gate C, near the security checkpoint." "I'll be there in 2 minutes." Edward ended the call and looked back at the girl. "Someone I trust is coming. He'll help us figure this out." She nodded but didn't say anything. True to his word, James arrived within minutes, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before landing on Edward and the girl. He was a man who was used to dealing with high-pressure situations, accustomed to handling last-minute changes in plans and executing solutions with precision. But even James hesitated for a fraction of a second when he saw the child standing beside Edward, holding onto his sleeve like she belonged there. "Sir," James greeted, his tone level but questioning. Edward straightened. "We have a situation." James's gaze flickered between him and the girl, assessing. "I see that. Who is she?" "That's what we're going to find out." James nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. "We could have security check the cameras, see who she came in with." Edward shook his head. "She doesn't want to go to security. And based on what she's told me, I'm not sure I trust whoever brought her here to be looking for her." James absorbed this information quickly, then turned to the girl, softening his usually professional demeanor. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, glancing at Edward before answering. "I don't remember." James didn't react outwardly, but Edward knew him well enough to catch the small shift in his expression. "All right," James said carefully. "What's the plan?" Edward glanced down at the girl, then back at James. "We take her with us." James blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Sir, you're supposed to be on a flight in 2 hours." Edward exhaled, glancing at his watch. That flight, that trip, suddenly felt completely insignificant. "Cancel it," he said. James didn't question him further. He simply pulled out his phone and started making the necessary calls. Edward looked back down at the girl. "We're going somewhere safe." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. And just like that, his entire life shifted. For the first time in years, he was walking away from a meticulously planned schedule, stepping into something completely unknown. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't regret it. Edward had never brought anyone to his penthouse before. His home was a space designed for efficiency, not comfort, built for a man who had no time for unnecessary distractions. Everything inside it was curated, minimalist furniture, clean lines, neutral colors. It was a place where he could think, work, and exist without the chaos of the outside world interrupting him. But now, as he stepped inside with the little girl still holding onto his sleeve, he realized just how empty it truly was. She hesitated at the entrance, her small frame still tense, her blue eyes scanning the space with caution. She wasn't like most children her age, there was no wide-eyed curiosity, no immediate interest in exploring. Instead, she stood stiffly, as if afraid that stepping further inside would mean she was intruding. Edward turned to James, who had followed them in, already scanning the room like the well-trained problem solver he was. He wasn't just an assistant, he was the closest thing Edward had to a right hand, someone who had handled crises far beyond missed meetings and last-minute travel changes. "We need information," Edward said, his voice level. "No one just abandons a child in an airport without a reason." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll start with private investigators. Someone has to be looking for her." Edward glanced down at the girl, her grip on his sleeve having loosened but not fully released. "Are you hungry?" She hesitated for a second before nodding. He wasn't used to asking those kinds of questions, let alone figuring out how to accommodate a child. His kitchen was rarely used, stocked mostly with high-end coffee, protein bars, and the occasional meal prepared by his staff when he worked late. He walked toward the fridge, opening it to scan what was inside, before realizing that nothing in there was suitable for a 6-year-old. Without missing a beat, James took over. "I'll have food delivered." Edward nodded, grateful for the quick solution. The girl stood by the large windows now, looking out at the city skyline. The view from his penthouse was something most people would admire, floor-to-ceiling glass that showcased the sprawling lights of downtown, the pulse of a city that never truly slept. But she didn't seem fascinated by it. She just stared, as if trying to piece together where she was and what came next. He walked over to her, standing at a slight distance so as not to overwhelm her. Do you remember anything? She shifted slightly, her small hands gripping the hem of her shirt. I remember being in a car, she murmured. It was dark. Edward studied her carefully. Was there anyone with you? She hesitated, then nodded. A man and a woman. But they weren't my parents. His jaw tightened. Did they say anything to you? Her blue eyes flickered toward him, filled with something he didn't like seeing in a child, fear mixed with uncertainty, as if she was debating whether she should tell him. Finally, she whispered, they told me to be quiet. That I had to wait for someone to come. Edward inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. And then they left you at the airport? She nodded. James, who had been listening, lowered his phone slightly. That doesn't sound like a random abandonment, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It sounds planned. Edward already knew that. He turned back to the girl. Do you remember where they took you before the airport? She frowned, pressing her lips together as if trying to recall something just out of reach. A hotel, I think. The windows had curtains that didn't open. Edward exchanged a glance with James, who was already taking notes. That narrows it down, James muttered. I'll check nearby hotels near the airport. The girl's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands tightening around the fabric of her shirt again. Edward watched her carefully. Do you remember your name? She hesitated longer this time. For a second, he thought she might not answer at all. But then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, Lily. It wasn't much. But it was something. Edward knelt slightly so he could meet her gaze. All right, Lily, he said, his voice steady. Until we figure out who you belong to, you're staying here. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. James glanced at him but didn't argue. Lily's small fingers tightened around the hem of her shirt again. You won't leave me? The question hit him harder than he anticipated. Edward exhaled slowly. No, he said simply. I won't. Lily studied him for a long moment before finally relaxing her shoulders just a little. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the first step. Edward had never been a man who second-guessed himself. Every decision he made was deliberate, every move calculated. But as he stood in his penthouse, watching a 6-year-old girl quietly nibble on a sandwich at his kitchen counter, he realized that this was the first situation in a long time where he had no clear strategy. Lily hadn't said much since she arrived. She ate cautiously, her small hands gripping the sandwich carefully, as if she was still waiting for someone to take it away. Edward noticed how she sat stiffly, her posture too controlled for a child her age, her blue eyes darting around the room like she was still trying to decide if this place was safe. He had seen the same behavior in boardrooms, in negotiations where people sat across from him, unsure of how much they could trust the man on the other side of the table. But this wasn't business. This was a little girl who had been abandoned at an airport, with no memory of her last name, no idea who had left her there, and no one coming to claim her. James stood a few feet away, his phone in hand as he went through the latest updates from the private investigators Edward had hired. No reports of a missing child matching her description, he said, his voice low but sharp with concern. No one's filed anything, no alerts, nothing in the databases. Edward frowned. That doesn't make sense. Someone had to bring her there. Someone should be looking for her. James nodded, scrolling through his notes. There was security footage from the airport. We're still reviewing it, but the initial report says she wasn't dropped off at the main entrance. They think she was left inside near the departure gates. No record of anyone reporting a lost child, no adults seen looking for her. Edward's grip tightened around his coffee cup. So they left her there deliberately. James hesitated before nodding. It looks that way. Edward exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had spent years building an empire where problems were solved with ruthless efficiency. This wasn't something he could fix with a well-placed call or a carefully negotiated deal. This was a child, alone and abandoned, and the more he learned, the worse it got. Lily had finished eating, setting the plate down with quiet precision. She glanced up at him, as if waiting to see what would happen next. He leaned against the counter, keeping his voice even. "How do you feel?" She hesitated before answering. "Better." "Good," he said. "You can stay here for now. Until we figure this out." She studied him for a long moment. "But what if no one comes for me?" Edward felt something tighten in his chest. She wasn't just asking for reassurance, she was preparing for the possibility that she had been left behind for good. He didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to promise something he wasn't sure of. But he did know one thing. "If that happens," he said carefully, "we'll figure out something else. You're not alone in this." Lily nodded, but the way she lowered her gaze told him she wasn't sure if she could believe him yet. James cleared his throat slightly, checking his watch. "I'll keep pressing our sources. In the meantime, what do you want me to do about?" He gestured slightly toward Lily, leaving the rest unsaid. Edward understood the question. What was the plan? What came next? He had no idea. But looking at the girl sitting quietly in his kitchen, he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Edward woke earlier than usual. His internal clock was tuned to business meetings, early flights, and high-stakes negotiations, but today was different. His mind wasn't on work, wasn't on the upcoming deals that his company was finalizing. Instead, it was on the small girl who had fallen asleep in the guest room down the hall. He had checked on her late last night, standing in the doorway for longer than he cared to admit. She had curled up beneath the heavy blankets, her small frame barely taking up space in the large bed. Her breathing had been even, but her hand had remained tightly wrapped around the fabric of her pillow, as if bracing herself for something. Now, as he stood in the kitchen, brewing his usual black coffee, he realized he had no idea how to start a morning with a child in his house. He was a man of strict routine, built around efficiency. Breakfast was something that happened on the go, usually prepared by his house staff or eaten at the office between meetings. But now, with Lily here, that wasn't going to work. James arrived just as Edward was staring at the fridge, realizing that nothing inside it was remotely appropriate for a 6-year-old. His assistant stepped into the kitchen, pausing briefly before raising an eyebrow. "You're making breakfast?" James asked, amusement clear in his tone. Edward exhaled, closing the fridge door. "I was considering it." James smirked. "And? There's nothing here she'll eat." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll have something delivered." Edward appreciated the efficiency, but something about it didn't sit right. The girl had been left alone at an airport, abandoned without an explanation. The least he could do was make sure she felt safe now. "Cancel it," he said, rolling up the sleeves of his dress shirt. "I'll do it myself." James didn't argue, but his smirk deepened. "This I have to see." Edward ignored him and focused on the task at hand. He found eggs and bread, something simple enough to work with. As he moved through the kitchen, cracking eggs into a pan, he caught James watching him like he was witnessing something unbelievable. "Don't you have something more productive to do?" Edward muttered. James leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "This is the most productive thing I've seen you do in years." Before Edward could respond, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. Lily appeared at the edge of the kitchen, still in the oversized t-shirt James had brought for her last night. Her blonde hair was slightly messy from sleep, and she hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure if she was allowed to step inside. Edward turned to her, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." She blinked, her blue eyes flicking between him and James before cautiously making her way to a chair. She sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, watching as he finished cooking. When he placed a plate in front of her, she looked down at it for a moment, her small fingers lightly gripping the edge. She took a careful bite, chewing thoughtfully before glancing up at him. "You made this?" she asked, as if the idea was almost impossible. Edward nodded. "Yes." She hesitated, then took another bite. "It's not bad." James snorted, and Edward shot him a warning glance before turning his attention back to Lily. "You can tell me if you don't like something," he said, watching her carefully. "You don't have to be polite." Lily shrugged. "I do like it." She took another bite, slower this time. "I just don't remember the last time someone made breakfast for me." Edward felt something shift in his chest, a quiet ache he didn't want to acknowledge. He didn't push for more information. Instead, he sat down across from her, his own plate untouched as he watched her eat. James cleared his throat, checking his phone. "Our people are still looking into any missing persons cases. No updates yet." Lily's shoulders tensed slightly at the mention of missing persons, but she didn't say anything. Edward exhaled. "We'll figure it out." Lily glanced up at him, her blue eyes cautious but searching. "And if you don't?" He didn't hesitate. "Then you stay here." She stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. But for the first time, she looked just a little less afraid. Edward had never been the type of man to second-guess his decisions. He built an empire on certainty, on knowing the outcome before he even made a move. But as he sat in his office later that morning, reviewing documents on his laptop, he found his thoughts drifting away from work, something that rarely, if ever, happened. Lily was in the next room, where James had set up a quiet space for her with books, puzzles, and a small television. She hadn't asked for anything, hadn't complained, hadn't made a sound since she finished breakfast. That was what unsettled him the most. Most children would have been asking questions by now, demanding to know what was going to happen next, clinging to whatever adult was closest in search of comfort. But Lily simply existed in silence, as if she was trying not to take up space, as if she had already learned that asking for things led to disappointment. Edward exhaled, closing his laptop. He wasn't the type to ignore problems, and this, whatever this was, wasn't something he could afford to push aside. He stood, walking to the adjoining room where Lily was sitting cross-legged on the couch, flipping absently through the pages of a book she wasn't really reading. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but guarded, as if preparing herself for something. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "What do you usually do during the day?" She blinked, as if the question had surprised her. "I don't know." "You don't know?" She hesitated, fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the book. "I move around a lot. I don't always get to do the same things." Something cold settled in Edward's chest. "You move around a lot." She nodded. "We never stayed anywhere for too long." His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Who was we?" Lily's small fingers gripped the book a little tighter. "My mom." Edward waited, but she didn't say anything else. He chose his next words carefully. "And the people who left you at the airport?" For the first time, something flickered in her expression. A brief flash of something he couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or uncertainty. She looked down at the book, running her fingers over the page before answering. "They weren't my mom." Edward exhaled slowly, pushing away the frustration he felt building inside him. He didn't want to press her, didn't want to force something she wasn't ready to say. But every piece of information she gave him only confirmed what he already suspected: this was bigger than just a lost child. He walked over and sat in the chair across from her, keeping enough distance to make sure she didn't feel trapped. "We're going to figure this out," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But until then, I need you to tell me if anything doesn't feel right. If you remember something important." If you feel scared. Lily looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not she believed him. Finally, she gave a small nod. Okay. Edward studied her for a second longer before nodding in return. Good. She went back to flipping through the book, her posture a little more relaxed than before. As he stood to leave, she suddenly spoke again. Are you going back to work now? Edward paused, glancing at her. I was. Lily tilted her head slightly, considering that. You don't have to stay with me all the time. I can be quiet. Edward let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. That's not the point. She watched him carefully. Then what is the point? He hesitated for a second before answering. You're not something I can just ignore, Lily. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for him to see it. It wasn't trust, not yet. But maybe, for the first time, it was the beginning of something close. That evening, Edward found himself doing something he never thought he would, adjusting his entire schedule for someone else. His life had always been dictated by structure, by efficiency, by the next deal, the next acquisition, the next step in expanding his empire. He had never let anything interfere with that. But now, there was a 6-year-old girl in his home, sitting at his kitchen table, stirring a spoon absent-mindedly in a bowl of soup she had barely touched. She wasn't refusing to eat, but she wasn't really engaging with the meal either. She seemed lost in thought, her blue eyes flicking to the large windows that overlooked the glowing city skyline. Edward sat across from her, watching carefully. He had spent years reading people, knowing when they were lying, when they were holding something back, when they were about to make a move that would change the course of a negotiation. But Lily wasn't a business deal, and that made her harder to read. He took a sip of his own drink before speaking. You don't like the soup? She shook her head, barely lifting her spoon. It's fine. That didn't answer the question. She hesitated, then shrugged. I'm just not really hungry. Edward set his glass down. Because of everything that's going on. Lily looked at him for a moment, then nodded. He leaned back slightly, considering his next words. Do you want to talk about it? She hesitated again, but this time, she didn't shake her head. That was progress. She looked down at her spoon, stirring the liquid again. I don't know what's supposed to happen next. Edward exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He understood that feeling better than she probably realized. He had built his entire life on knowing what came next, but this was unfamiliar territory for both of them. What do you want to happen next? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tapped her spoon against the side of the bowl, thinking. I want to know where my mom is, she finally said. Edward nodded, his chest tightening slightly. That was the one thing he couldn't give her, not yet. I want to know if she's okay, Lily added quietly. And if she's not, I want to know why she didn't come for me. Her voice was steady, but Edward could hear the uncertainty beneath it, the way she was trying not to sound as scared as she really was. He leaned forward slightly. James is still looking. He's using every resource we have to find her. But until we do, I don't want you to worry about what-ifs. We'll figure it out when we get there. Lily looked up at him, searching his face for something. And what if we never do? Edward didn't answer right away. He knew better than to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But what he could promise was that she wouldn't go through this alone. Then we deal with that, too, he said firmly. Lily studied him, her blue eyes unreadable, but there was something in her posture that relaxed just slightly. She picked up her spoon and took a small bite of the soup. Edward didn't say anything, didn't push for more conversation. But he stayed seated across from her until she had finished. That night, after she had gone to bed, he found himself standing outside her room, staring at the closed door longer than necessary. For the first time in his life, his priorities had shifted. And he didn't regret it. This story is more than just a tale of a powerful man whose life is disrupted by an unexpected responsibility. It's about transformation, about how even the most controlled and structured lives can be unraveled by something as simple, and as profound, as human connection. Edward Stanton begins as a man defined by power, wealth, and a strict sense of order. He has spent years building an empire, making decisions with ruthless efficiency, and ensuring that nothing and no one can shake his carefully constructed world. But when Lily enters his life, everything changes. What makes this story compelling is not just the mystery surrounding Lily, who she is, where she came from, and why she was abandoned, but the way she forces Edward to confront something he has never faced before, responsibility that cannot be delegated, controlled, or reasoned away. For the first time, he is faced with a problem that doesn't have a strategic solution, only a human one. The ending is powerful not because Edward suddenly becomes a perfect father figure overnight, but because he chooses to stay. He chooses to be there, to be someone Lily can rely on, even when the answers about her past remain uncertain. The true resolution isn't just in finding out what happened to Lily's mother or uncovering the truth about her past, it's in the bond that grows between them, in the moment Lily finally starts to believe she is safe, and in the realization that Edward, for all his success, was missing something far greater than he ever understood. This is a story about change, about how sometimes the most unexpected people enter our lives and turn everything upside down, forcing us to see what truly matters. Edward thought he had everything, but in the end, it wasn't his wealth or his power that defined him. It was the simple act of holding on when someone needed him the most. And that, more than anything, made him the man he was always meant to be.